I did a poor job of capturing this on Zoom. I'm going to go through this PowerPoint really fast. Okay, so we started class with going over the lab learning outcomes, so you can pause the video here and go through these and make sure you understand them. And then we talked about these trees and how they're equivalent. So what do I mean by equivalent? It's just two ways of drawing these trees. So I'm going to use my mouse. And so you have to decide if they're equivalent, they should have the same groupings together. So if you're looking at this top tree, we have G and H as a monophyletic clade, and then F right outside them. Do we have that here? We do. We have G and H with F right outside. And then we have D and E that's sister to these guys. And D and E, and indeed, are sisters to these guys. And then B and C, and then A. So you can see that these trees are equivalent. There's just two ways of drawing them. So when we're looking at a phylogeny, that's what these trees are called. These species across the top, that's what these are. So time is going from the bottom to the top, ancient to recent. And so these are all species that survived to modern day. When we're looking at a node, this is a common ancestor. Now remember, it's not one organism that gave birth to F and G. That would be nutso. It's a population that somehow got separated. And we talked in class today about, it could have been separated by allopatry, which is where there's a physical barrier, like the Grand Canyon, for instance, or sympatry, where there's like a behavioral barrier, like the birds of paradise or the hawthorn flies and the apple maggot flies. And then here is branching. This is the branch, sorry, and this is where you would put the characters. So you would map characters that, these things were evolving these, but they weren't speciating, they hadn't split yet. So that's what a branch is. Okay, so then I had students take this 4-question quiz. If you want to pause the video right here, you could try your hand at answering these questions, and then we'll talk about each one. Okay, so pause the video here if you want to take the quiz. Okay, so looking at number 1, character 6, so you can see this, it shows up on C and H. And you can see that no one down here, none of the ancestors had 6. It just randomly shows up at the top of the tree. So this is a case of convergent evolution, where they have similar structures, but it's not because of a common ancestry. So let's review that. So if you're looking at like character 9, that's an ancestral characteristic that F, G, and H all share because an ancestor, that ancestor that was right here, shares that. And so we would call that homology. Okay, whereas character 6, like we talked about, is due to convergent evolution. We call that analogy. Okay, so then we took a look at this phylogeny, and these colors are just like, let's say we have a character, and let's literally say it's color, right? And you can see that B and C are orange, and D and G are green, and E and F are blue, and A is yellow. And so I asked students to, what do they notice on these trees? And you might notice that B and C have orange, and it looks like their ancestor was orange. So this is some kind of derived trait that B and C have. You can see that D and G are both green, but their ancestors weren't green. So this is a case of convergence. You can see that E and F are just maintaining that ancestral trait. It started blue, they've just stayed blue. And then A has developed some brand new characteristic that's yellow. So if we're talking about evolution, this is kind of the verb form. Are we having, it's divergence or it's convergence? They're diverging into different species, or they're converging onto the same trait like D and G. Whereas the outcome is, if it's divergent, then these are a homology, right? If it's convergent, then you call it an analogy. And so I'm going to label those on the tree. One is due to common ancestry, one is due to a common environment. So orange would be a homology and green would be an analogy. So then we talked about synapomorphies and simplesiomorphies. So a synapomorphy is a characteristic that has been derived from some ancestral characteristic that everybody shares. So for example, in vertebrates, that vertebral column, the bony backbone that we have, is a synapomorphy. The ancestral trait was an undivided neurocord or supporting rod. And so we also have these things called character reversals, where the synapomorphy for all mammals, for instance, is a body covered in hair. But we have some mammals, like the hairless mole rat, that have lost the covering of hair, or like that we have hairless rats now too. And so that would be a character reversal. You can think of whales losing their limbs, snakes losing their limbs. These are all character reversals. And then we have simplesiomorphies. So simplesiomorphies are where they're maintaining that ancestral trait, but there are others in the group that have something derived. So if we look at snakes and alligators and chickens, so alligators are more closely related to chickens than they are to snakes. But snakes and alligators both have scales all over their bodies, whereas chickens only have scales on their little feet and they've got feathers, which are a modified scale. And so you can see that these two, if you were to group them by scales all over their bodies, you're kind of leaving somebody out because they're maintaining that ancestral trait, which we call a simplesiomorph, whereas the chicken has a derived trait, a synapomorph. All right, so if we're looking at a homology, something that has, they share because of common ancestry. So let's look right here at E, F, and G. Okay, they all shared this blue ancestral trait. E and F still have it, so they're the same because of a simplesiomorphic homology. Whereas if we looked at, if G represented all the birds and we looked at like chickens and hawks and all those things, they would have a shared synapomorphy. So it's homologous, but it's a synapomorphy. Okay, this is not a good example, this green, because we're also talking about a homology or a homoplasy. So in the case of D and G, they both evolved this weird funky green, and that's an analogy. We would call it homoplastic or a homoplasy. This here, nobody else has it on the tree. We would call it an autapomorphy. Don't worry too much about that word. All right, so there's a synapomorphy. They share a derived trait. And here's a simplesiomorphy. And there's a homoplasy. Okay, so going back to our quiz, if we look at number 2, which of the following species pair would you expect to share the most similarities? Well, it's those that are grouped together as more closely related. So D and E, they ran the race for a longer amount of time, so they share the most traits, right? So D and E. And so if we look, here's a common ancestor for B and C. And remember, it's a common ancestral population, not a single ancestor individual. Okay, here would be a common ancestor for F, G, and H. This here, when we're just having a branch and we're deriving a characteristic, but there's no speciation event going on, that would be considered phyletic evolution. When a speciation event happens, we call it branching evolution. Okay, now let's look at our groupings. So if you were to grab E, F, G, and H, we would call this a paraphyletic group. We're leaving out D. And you might think, well, why would you ever do that? Well, I'll show you some examples where we accidentally do that. That's bad. What we're really interested in are monophyletic groups. And a monophyletic group is all species that came from the same common ancestor. So if we looked back at our paraphyletic group, E, F, G, and H, if we trace that back to their common ancestor, it's right here. And if we say, okay, who do we have to include to make it monophyletic? Well, it has to be everybody that branched off that branch. So it's got to include D as well. So if we're looking back at this description again, if you group by a synapomorphy, something that's shared and derived, you're going to end up with a monophyletic clade because everybody's got it. If you group by a simplesiomorphy, you may accidentally make a paraphyletic clade that you're leaving somebody out. And then if you group by a homoplasy, you get this polyphyletic clade where it's just two random species on the tree. Okay, so looking at our last two, if species F is a turtle, G is a lizard, and H is a snake, what could 9 be? Well, it's got to be something that all three have, so that would be the presence of scales. And then the last one, character number 6, is the absence of at least one pair of limbs. What could C be? Well, which of these organisms is missing a pair of limbs? That would be the whale. All right, so looking here, why might we make a paraphyly? So look at reptilia. So when we think of reptiles, we generally think of turtles, snakes and lizards, crocodiles, and we call that reptilia. But notice that is not a monophyletic clade, it's a paraphyletic clade. We have to include birds in it because birds are more closely related to crocodiles than crocodiles are to the rest of the reptiles. And so to make it monophyletic, we actually have to include all of them. But we do it out of convenience. Same thing here, if you look at fish, if you were to characterize all of these as fish, the cephalochordates are a weird fish. Chondrichthyes are cartilaginous fish like sharks and rays and chimeras. And then osteichthyes are ray-finned fish like salmon and trout and goldfish, right? But if you call all of these guys fish, who else do you have to include to make it monophyletic? You have to include everybody, including us. Hence the name of your book, Your Inner Fish, right? Fish is not a monophyletic clade either. But we do it out of convenience sometimes, but it's not very meaningful evolutionarily. So let's look here. What character could we put right here that would include osteichthyes and up? And you might say bones, a bony skeleton, right? Cartilaginous fish only have bone in their jaw. They don't have bones anywhere else. Right here, what could you put? Well, maybe limbs or lungs, right? And then if you were to grab birds and mammals, which I don't know why you would, but let's say you were grouping by wings and you chose bats and birds, that would be a polyphyly. That's an analogy, convergent evolution. Okay, so parsimony principle is what we're using, and that means that the preferred tree has the least number of changes. It's the simplest explanation, right? And so we're going to try to reduce homoplasy on the tree, or convergence. All right, so then we did these 3 tests. So you should pause the video here, see if you can answer these, and then I'll give you the answer. Okay, so in this case, feathers would be considered homologous. It's common because of their common ancestry. It represents a synapomorphy. It's a derived trait, and it would group these into a monophyletic group. Okay, pause here and do this one. Okay, so in this case, a body fully covered in scales, notice lizards and crocodiles, it is homologous. Scales are down here in an ancestor, so they do have scales because of a homology, but it's the ancestral trait rather than the derived trait, so we would call it a simplesiomorphy, and it creates this weird paraphyletic group. Okay, here's another one. Go ahead and pause for a minute. Okay, so if we group by wings, in this case, if we include dragonflies in our group, then this is an analogy, right? These are convergents. So it represents a homoplasy, and it would make this weird polyphyletic group. Okay, and then we practice doing this tree. I've posted another video for doing this tree. Oh, and actually, we didn't do this until next class, and I've got this recorded. So I'll stop there.